recording this session, so I will go ahead and do that now. We are joined today, thank you, Ciara. We are joined today by Ciara Raudsepp-Hearne, who's the Canada KBA Coordinator, hosted by Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. So she'll be starting us off with a brief overview of the KBA program. Then we will be hearing a presentation from Dan Kraus, who's a Senior Conservation Biologist with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And finally, James Snider, who's the VP of Science, Knowledge and Innovation with the World Wildlife Fund Canada. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Again, use that chat function to send any questions you might have. And Ciara can kick us off.
Super. So can you see my slides there?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you all very much for joining us today, and we hope to have a number of talks over the coming months that introduce you to both the work that we're doing to identify key biodiversity areas on the ground across the whole country, but also a number of science projects that we have on the side around assessing across the nation. All sorts of different projects that we're running. But I'm going to start with a very short overview to give you an idea for those of you who have not been introduced to the concept of key biodiversity areas. What I'm going to try to convey is what actually a key biodiversity area is and what it isn't. It is something very specific. It's not just generally an area that's important for biodiversity. It's an area that meets very specific criteria and thresholds related to those criteria. And so the Key Biodiversity Area Standard was developed over the course of about 12 years by a global partnership, including lots of different major NGOs working globally, lots of scientists, governments, etc., and it was reviewed by many different partners. And what it does is it captures, the idea behind it was that there used to be all sorts of standardized tools for trying to identify areas that were important for birds, areas that were important for butterflies or for plants. And there was a request to the global conservation community to develop a method that would be sort of an umbrella method for capturing all types of biodiversity using one tool. And so this is what this represents. And this little cartoon from A to E represents the different types of biodiversity that can be captured by the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. So A is globally threatened biodiversity. So those are threatened species and threatened ecosystems as well. So this is not just focused on species, and they have to be threatened in very particular categories as assessed through particular systems, such as the IUCN Red List or the NatureServe system, or in Canada, COSEWIC. So they have to be standardized systems that are well documented. B is geographically restricted biodiversity, so that includes geographically restricted species as well as ecosystems. So that's often species or ecosystems that are found only in a couple of different places in the whole world or within Canada. C is this idea of ecological integrity. So these are capturing sites that have the highest ecological integrity, so a very low industrial human footprint and a high biotic integrity. So the same kinds of assemblages of plants and ecosystem components that are in this a very similar state through time that haven't changed very much. How to measure that is a different question, and we have a group of scientists across about 10 different institutions in Canada who are developing the methods for that. And that criteria will be very interesting in Canada because we have some of the only systems in the world that have very high ecological integrity. Criterion D is biological processes. So these actually capture sites where species gather. So this one's very focused on species, not ecosystems, but where species gather in very large numbers throughout their life cycles or processes. So that includes things like migratory stopovers for birds, caribou calving sites, bat hibernacula, and things like that. So you can see that there's a range of biodiversity elements that are captured through this standard. One thing that I should note is that it's very much a site-scaled approach. So it's not the be-all and end-all. It is one tool to capture sites that are important for the persistence of biodiversity. E is trying to capture sites that are irreplaceable through quantitative analysis. That is one where the methods also haven't been developed to the fullest extent, so we're not using that one right now. And then the last cartoon on the bottom right is to note that the KBA standard, which is a small booklet that lays out what the criteria and thresholds are and what they can apply to, are accompanied by a very thick book on guidelines of how to apply the global standard. So just a few more things about what a KBA is and what it isn't before I say what we're doing in Canada. So these are sites that are recognized internationally and as well as nationally, because we have this nationally endorsed program in Canada, and as holding exceptional biodiversity values. These are values that may exist here and nowhere else in the world, and they may need stewardship. It's not another single species approach, as I mentioned before. It's a broad biodiversity approach that includes multiple species, all taxa, as well as ecosystems. These sites are not negotiated. The site meets a set quantitative threshold, or it doesn't. So it's a scientific analytical tool based on international criteria. So a place either is or it isn't a KBA, depending on whether it holds enough of a biodiversity element within the site to meet those standards. And the way we go about identifying KBAs is we first need to identify biodiversity elements that may qualify. So for example, species at risk in a certain category, such as critically endangered, or an ecosystem that is very geographically restricted and only occurs in, for example, northern Saskatchewan. And then we have to determine whether sufficient data exists to identify a site that holds the required proportion of the species population or the ecosystem extent. And then we do find that that threshold is met. We draw a tight boundary around the biodiversity elements if those thresholds are met. A key biodiversity area can hold just one qualifying biodiversity element, so it can be identified as a key biodiversity area because of just one qualifying ecosystem, for example, an Alvar site in southern Ontario, or it can have multiple elements. So another site of interest might be a Sable Island in Nova Scotia, where it qualifies as a key biodiversity area for, I think, somewhere between 6 and 10 different species, from invertebrates to marine mammals, as well as plants. And KBAs can be any size within reason, and this is a little bit where there's a bit of room for interpretation here, but it has to be still considered to be a site. It shouldn't be, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. But just to give you an idea of the range of sizes, that we've identified KBAs for a rare plant in the Yukon, and for Banff Springs snail within Banff National Park, and those sites would be less than a kilometer squared. Whereas Long Point IBA, which is being reassessed as a KBA for not just the birds that it still qualifies for, but also a number of plants and other species, and that's 241 square kilometers. It has about 20 qualifying species there. So how do KBAs fit into the conservation landscape? And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today with both James and Dan. It's a complementary layer of biodiversity knowledge to enhance decision-making and planning. So it's information, and you can use it in any way where it fits. So it can be used in protected area design, and that was the original reason for bringing it to Canada under the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process, to try to figure out, if we're going to expand our protected area network, how can we make sure that we're capturing the right areas that are important for the persistence of biodiversity? And key biodiversity areas were chosen as one standard tool that's very robust, that everyone can understand, as one way to achieve that goal. But you can also use it for building a case for management, for example, in the development of applications for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, where key biodiversity areas may not be the driving force and should not be necessarily the driving force, but could strengthen the case for a site. It could be used in resource planning, land use planning, environmental assessments, citizen science initiatives, different kinds of stewardship, acquisition of sites for conservation in private lands, for example. Two things that I just wanted to stress before I move on. There is no management prescription or impact on access to land that comes with the identification of a key biodiversity area. Those decisions on how to make use of the information that this is a site that is we need to do something with. It's a site that's particularly important to the persistence of a particular species or ecosystem. Those decisions are made by the people who are on the land, the people who hold rights to that land, who have some sort of stake in that land. So that's beyond the step of the science process that we are engaged in right now. But we're trying to prepare for that by bringing people in who have an interest in the land to participate in the process so they can understand why it's a key biodiversity area. So key biodiversity areas are a building block, I would say, to feed into conservation planning of all types. And that's, as I mentioned before, it is one approach. You need to, for even wise protected area planning, you need to combine this information on key biodiversity areas, which does capture very specific elements of biodiversity in a very specific way, but you need to consider that along with information about connectivity, representativity across ecosystems and ecoregions, biocultural values, climate modeling, etc. So it's one piece of information. This is what KBA Canada looks like. On the left in the gray is the global KBA program, and we interact with them quite a bit because they're responsible for the KBA standard and for the guidelines and the world database on key biodiversity areas. But in Canada, we have quite an extensive coalition as well. The logos at the top are some of our more active members of the Canadian Key Biodiversity Area Coalition, but there are many others that are not represented there. And I apologize if you're an active member and you don't see yourself reflected there. From that group, we have a management committee that meets once a month. We have a secretariat that's based at WCS Canada, and we have two Canadian databases being developed by Birds Canada and by NatureServe Canada. One is gathering together all of the data that we're using to identify key biodiversity areas, and the Birds Canada one, because they already have an important bird area database, they're expanding it and redesigning it to consider all taxa as well as ecosystems that fit into the KBA standard. So our progress to date, I won't get into this in too much detail, but please send me an email if you have questions about any of it. We're developing a lot of infrastructure. We spent a year and a half doing that, including the governance infrastructure, but also a website, a national KBA standard, which I'll present one slide on that at the end, and databases, as well as range maps. So our partners at NatureServe Canada are developing range maps for all the species that are relevant to the KBA work. Those will be all publicly available, along with another quite a lot of data that will be interesting to conservation generally. Our coalition progress is ramping up. So we have regional coordinators. We're taking a regional approach so that the right people in each province and territory are involved in the identification of key biodiversity areas, so that the data is right, the interpretation of the data is right, and that there's some understanding on the ground of the conservation context as well. We are also partnering with lots of academic institutions. There are a number of postdocs and PhD students involved in this work on different aspects of it. We had completed 3 workshops towards the beginning of the year. As with most of you, a lot of that work is on hold. We're trying to develop virtual alternatives, which are a sorry alternative, but at least we're flying less. We are continuing with outreach and partnership building. There's Indigenous engagement at local, regional, and national scales. We're trying to emphasize that as much as possible and put in a lot of effort to reach out to people who have rights to the land across the country to make sure that they both know about this work far in advance of any of the work being done and can contribute as they wish. And then aside from that focus, there's a big focus on provinces and territories, which is the scale at which decisions are made in Canada. So these are the main regional and thematic initiatives that are underway. We have work that's almost complete in Yukon. There's a pilot project in the Northwest Territories. Well, I won't read through all of these, but just to point out that some of them are regional, some of them are more thematic. Like we did a national freshwater KBA identification workshop last February. Some of them are worth pointing out too. We have a partnership at Guelph University led by a postdoc and the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership to figure out how biocultural values interact with ecological values that are held in the Key Biodiversity Area Standard, which is very much a traditional top-down approach to identifying areas of importance for biodiversity. So we're trying to figure out how we can make that or understand it in a way that is relevant to all Canadians. So I've touched on some of the other ones there. You'll notice that there are some regional gaps. We're working on those regional gaps. We want there to be good partnerships in place in those places before we launch in. So we started off with an opportunistic approach, and now we're fundraising to try to fill in some of those gaps. So I'm going to end in 2 seconds here, but I just wanted to point out one tool, which is we have recently completed a draft of the national standard, which is an adaptation of the global KBA standard. So the global standard identifies sites that make significant contributions to the global persistence of biodiversity, and we wanted to improve the relevance of this tool to the Canadian context. So we've adapted it, and the main ways in which it's been adapted are the inclusion of designatable units, so species or taxa below the species level. So that allows us to look, for example, at caribou populations individually as populations, as opposed to one species across the globe, which doesn't make so much sense in the conservation context in Canada. We then are allowed to also look at it with the national standard, nationally listed species at risk, whereas before we were only looking at globally listed species at risk, as well as ecosystems at risk, I should point out. And then the main difference is when we're calculating thresholds. So for example, do you have 1% of the global population of a particular mollusk at a site in Canada? That's for a global KBA, but for a national KBA, the reference population would be the national population. So you'd need to have 1% of the national population of that mollusk at a site to qualify as a national KBA. I'm going to end on this nice graphic, which shows is one representation of what you get by looking at the national standard. So the global species so the global standard, the qualifying species at risk that we'd be looking at in Canada, there's about 682. If you include a taxa below the species level in Canada for this one criterion, which is species at risk, you end up looking at 2,281. The vast majority of these we won't be able to identify a key biodiversity area for because there's just not enough data. We don't have a good enough understanding of their distributions in Canada, but for many we will. And the other thing that's fun about this slide is that you can see the kinds of taxa that are appearing. And this is going to segue well into Dan Kraus's talk, because you see that there's lichens, invertebrates, plants of different types, and these are all taxa that don't get a lot of conservation attention, but some of them exist only in Canada. And so we're very excited by the kinds of things that we're able to pick up using this particular tool. I can answer more questions about that if you want after. But for now, I'll leave it at that. And if you want to learn more, you can visit the website. And let's move on to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Ciara. Again, if you have any questions for Ciara or for the rest of our panelists, feel free to put them in the chat box. You're up, Dan.
All right, great. Can you just confirm that you see my slides?
Sure do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Dan Kraus with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Really looking forward to quickly sharing this report with you, which we released back in the spring on Canada's nationally endemic species. And as you heard, these species that are threatened or geographically restricted sort of fit in nicely to some of the different KBA criteria. Before I give you the summary, I just want to acknowledge co-authors, Amy from NatureServe. NatureServe manages all of the data on our nationally endemic species, and Amy kind of managed that database, compared our list to the US list to be able to figure out those species that only live in Canada. And Andrea, who I work with in our Guelph office at Nature Conservancy of Canada, who did all of the spatial analysis and also created the project website, which I'll show you a link for. There were also experts from across the country that helped us out. A lot of these species, especially some of the arthropods, had a lot of taxonomical challenges, and we really relied on experts from across the country to help us out in terms of determining the status and the distribution of many of these species, and we were very grateful for that. So I want to talk a little bit about why we decided to do this project. Part of it was a couple of years ago, more and more about the extinction crisis that we're facing as a planet, and really thinking about, well, what is Canada's role in stopping this extinction, sometimes referred to as the sixth extinction of our planet. And we know that there are many species that we need to save in Canada. Canada has about 80,000 species, and you saw the slide showing those species are of national and of global conservation concern, and we absolutely need to protect them all, and we shouldn't leave any species behind. But our goal was to think about, what are the species that we have full responsibility for as Canadians, and that if we lose them, it's not just a loss for Canada, but it's a loss for the world's biological diversity. And so we embarked on sort of figuring out which species are nationally endemic to Canada, occur here and nowhere else in the world. We were able to build on a lot of existing work. There had been work done even back into the 1970s, looking at areas of endemism in Canada. And then recently some great reports from NatureServe, Environment Canada Climate Change, that started to assemble some of this information on endemic species. In terms of defining them, I'm going to say species, but we actually do mean we do include subspecies and varieties as well. We didn't include designatable units, and then we did include my birds that only breed in Canada. There's only 2 of them. I guess 3 if you count Labrador duck, but that was a small group. But species that are essentially only found in our country. We came up with a list of about 308. And as you saw, most of them are vascular plants and arthropods. That basically reflects that most of the species in Canada are vascular plants or arthropods. About 80% of the nationally endemic species are made up of these 2 groups. They do occur across the country. Nationally endemic species are found in every province. They're actually found in almost every ecological region of Canada as well, but they're not distributed evenly. British Columbia, Alberta, Quebec, and Yukon have the vast majority of these nationally endemic species. We tried to map them out the best that we could to identify hotspots in terms of KBAs that fits in nicely to the criteria around co-occurring geographically restricted species. We identified about 27 hotspots of these nationally endemic species. These hotspots occur in every province and territory, and they're often associated with areas that have unique habitats like Lake Athabasca, islands like Sable Island, and also areas that were likely refugia during the last period of glaciation. That includes some areas in Canada's Arctic and in the mountains of Yukon. We were able to look at the global status of these species, and most of them are globally imperiled. Only about 10% of Canada's nationally endemic species are globally secure. Some of them do have large ranges, large numbers. They just happen to only occur in Canada. But most of them are of global conservation concern. 8 of them are already extinct. What was surprising was the large number that we don't know a lot of we don't have a lot of information about. About a third of the species that we identified as nationally endemic are unranked or unrankable by NatureServe. In addition, we had a list of over 150 species where there just was not enough information at all to make a call if they're nationally endemic or not. Some of these, there was only a type locality. Some of them, there were several records, but they were all very close to the US border, and it seemed reasonable that they could occur there. And we're hoping that this list and these huge information gaps in species that could potentially only be found in Canada will be taken up by researchers, and we'll hopefully gather more information on them in the next few years. As I mentioned, there is a report website. If you go, you can read the report, but you can also download a couple of Excel sheets that have all of the endemic species and also these potential endemic species, which, as I said, would be great research subjects for people to look at, especially since you can't leave the country. How we're going to be using the information. Nature Conservancy of Canada, we're going to be using it for conservation planning and management. It does help to identify species that we already have on our properties that we should probably put some real focus into making sure that they're doing well. And also with the mapping that we created, you can see the map of Quebec. We do have a grid map that shows where some of these hotspots are, and we can use that to identify priority areas for conservation. As mentioned, the mapping is getting better with the ecosystem-based automatic range maps. I'd encourage you to go to this website, look at some of the maps that have been done, but also some of the priorities. And if you're an expert in any of the taxa that are on that list, your help would be appreciated in refining these range maps for these species. Next steps. One thing that was suggested to us is we could look at species that are not necessarily nationally endemic, but Canada has a large degree of jurisdictional responsibility. So there's lots of species, for example, around the Great Lakes that most of them are in Canada. There's just a few in the States, but we still have what we do in Canada is important for their conservation. I think the next thing that we're going to be looking at, though, ecosystems. There are a number of ecological systems in Canada, from some of these rock barrens in Atlantic Canada, some of our peatland systems in the north, there are alvars in Ontario that do not appear to occur in the United States, and identifying and mapping these endemic ecological systems would be another way to identify priority sites. And then finally, we're hoping that it will inspire people. As Canadians, we want everyone to be aware of what's happening in the world, but these are plants and animals that we can only save here in Canada. So hopefully it's a way to inform and inspire Canadians around the extinction crisis. Just last year, the IUCN had the Abu Dhabi call to halt the decline of species, and it's called to stop extinction by 2030. And as Canadians, these are over 300 species where it's completely up to us, and we can play a role in stopping their extinction to protect biodiversity in Canada, but also in the world. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. Okay, James, are you ready?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation to join the conversation here. Great to have so much interest on the line here. Really great people, group of people joining the conversation. And thanks to Ciara and Dan for their overviews here. Really important work that the two of you are doing, and really representative of a whole host of individuals and organizations that are working to protect important places in Canada and beyond. And the biodiversity and extinction framing that you provided, Dan, I think is so critical. I'm going to be speaking today about WWF Canada's Living Planet report, which was in early September, and certainly how the role of key biodiversity areas factor into some of the key findings of that report. I do want to acknowledge, of course, members of the Science, Knowledge and Innovation team, in particular Jessica Curry and Emily Giles on my team have been working to secure and develop the Living Planet report here in Canada, leading that analysis as well as their help in this presentation here today. As Dan put it well, we're in the midst of really two dual crises on a global stage, that of climate change and biodiversity loss. And the science, I think, here is increasingly clear. There's been a kind of rolling news for years now, punctuated certainly by the IPBES report last summer, the IPCC special report on climate change and land. The scientific evidence in terms of where we are globally right now is very clear. We are losing species at an unprecedented rate globally, and climate change is happening here and now. And very clearly the hazards and impacts of climate change are happening here too in Canada, where we have been noted as warming at twice the global average, and in our far north, I think is as much as 3 to 4 times that. The Living Planet Report Canada focuses on trends in vertebrate populations, and I think I just need to make that very clear here from the onset, especially following Dan, is that this analysis speaks to vertebrate populations and trends in those populations from 1970 to 2016. Of greatest significance in that report are the status and trends really of 2 groups of species, and those are species at risk. The first are those IUCN listed species of global conservation concern, those on the IUCN red list that have been designated at risk of global extinction. And so Dan really put that well in terms of the various categories there. But perhaps most importantly here, we're seeing the populations of those species of global conservation concern have declined by 42% on average in the period 1970 to 2016. So we cannot simply assume that this is an issue that's happening elsewhere in the world. We are actually observing the decline of those species of conservation concern here in Canada too. The second number is, of course, for species of nationally assessed, those that are assessed by CSIWIC, the Committee on the Status of Indigenous Wildlife in Canada, and how they've fared in Canada. It's a larger number, 59% decline. I discount that a bit because, of course, in some ways the designation under CSIWIC might actually be looking to their status and trends. But the piece for me, and the one that I'm going to focus on primarily here, is on the IUCN result in terms of those species of global conservation concern and how they're faring in Canada. The second set of analysis that we focused on relates to threats. And this was
James.
Yes.
Could I just interrupt you? You don't seem to be on presenter view, and the slides are not changing.
Oh no. Okay.
We're just getting a couple of messages from people asking if you could switch that. Okay.
Tell me how it is now. Can you see that?
That looks good. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And so what we've seen in our analysis is that for species at risk in Canada, those that are assessed by CSIWIC, that those species are in fact facing 5 different threats on average. And so we've looked at IUCN assessed threats and for those CSIWIC assessed species and found that as a whole, we now are seeing these species are facing multiple threats. Importantly, climate change is now the 4th most frequent threat that those species are faced. And so that, I think, is a really important factor for us in terms of how we build our conservation strategies and respond in response to the dual crises. Very clearly, climate change and species at risk recovery, the loss of biodiversity, are deeply connected. So much so that, in fact, climate change is actually a driver of biodiversity loss here in Canada too. And so the solutions that we take, the approaches that we take moving forward, need to move beyond both the single species approach, and that was something that we focused on in our 2017 Living Planet report, as well as to addressing multiple threats at once, and the deeply interwoven threats of climate change and biodiversity loss. And certainly we recognize that there are solutions that allow us to integrate our approaches to the recovery of species at risk, to climate change, and also protected areas. And I think that is perhaps one of the single greatest takeaways for me, is in a Canadian context of how can we move those strategies forward in the coming decade, the so-called UN Decade of Restoration and beyond Decade of Action, for us to be weaving these 3 strategies together and knowing that we have great ambition there. And so across protection, stewardship in our working landscapes, but also in our degraded landscapes where many of those species at risk occur in the southern parts of Canada, that we are doing so in a way that has the greatest benefit for biodiversity, including species at risk, but also in terms of actively putting nature to work to fight climate change from a GHG emissions perspective. Over and above that, of course, we recognize the critical role of investing in so-called natural infrastructure to build our adaptive capacity to future climate change as well. These are all part of the same conversation. Taking a step back, of course, I think I need to recognize and applaud the ambition of the Government of Canada on the protected areas file, with commitments last week or the week before, rather. It's sort of a bit of time warp, apologize for that. Every day is somewhat the same. I'm sure you all can relate to that. But we saw earlier this month a major commitment from the Government of Canada in terms of joining the Leaders Pledge for Nature and also the High Ambition Coalition for Nature with a commitment to driving towards 30% protection of land and waters by 2030. Of course, Canada was the only one of the largest countries in the world to make such a commitment. And so there really is an important global role for Canada to be showing leadership now as we move forward in the path towards a new global biodiversity framework that CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity framework that's underway and being negotiated in the coming year. Of course, we need to recognize that Canada has made excellent strides in terms of our existing commitments under the pathway to Target 1 or the actually Target 11, exceeding our marine protected areas goal, now over 13.8%. On a protected areas, I believe we're just over 12% on our path towards 17%. But what I'm trying to illustrate here on this slide is the very significant task that we have ahead of us in terms of advancing protected areas, both to get to 2025, 25% there, and to 30% in the coming decade. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a great ambition here, and I think an important opportunity now following that ambition in terms of how we can protect the right places to ensure that those areas that we protect are able to deliver value for biodiversity, including species at risk, that can factor centrally into our climate change strategy. And so these conversations need to go hand in hand. And so there is an important moment ahead of us. And I think where Canada has a tremendous opportunity to be demonstrating how to do this well. And so I want to introduce this quickly, a piece of analysis that we brought forward, I guess it would have been in 2018, which is what's called our wildlife protection assessment. And this focused on terrestrial protected areas and essentially how we're faring, and looking at both ecological representation, but layering in above that some additional factors. Certainly the aggregations and congregations of species at risk and where they occur, that's on the top left side of the slide. And as you can imagine, many of those southern areas across the country are where we see the greatest number of our at-risk species, but also layering this conversation related to carbon storage and carbon sequestration, both above and below ground, and how protected areas, both formal protected areas, and some would even say de facto protection, can lead to the stewardship of that stored carbon so that we do not lead to future emissions. And finally, climate refugia, those places that are robust in the face of a changing climate. These are all factors that I think we need to be mindful of in designing our protected areas network. There's a link here at the bottom of the slide. You can find out more there. I'm mindful of time and there's more to be talked about. But just in terms of our overall performance, and including for protected areas right now, as a tool primarily in terms of avoiding conversion of habitat for species at risk, that's something that I think we've had some challenges with here. And I think many of those hotspots of at-risk species in Canada, at least in terms of federally listed species, I would say are typically not well represented in our protected areas network as a whole. Okay, so moving forward, and in Ciara's presentation, great overview of the KBA initiative and WF Canada and the WF network. We're very happy and supportive to be part of the Canadian KBA partnership and also the global KBA partnership. We believe that key biodiversity areas can be a critical pathway to helping identify those places that have greatest significance for biodiversity, including species at risk. Ciara also alluded to there is, of course, a broad suite of factors that we need to be considering in the identification and management of our protected areas. It's a complicated conversation. It's really a question of optimization, but where certainly I think first and foremost we need to recognize the role of Indigenous peoples in advancing Indigenous-led conservation as a cornerstone, clearly fundamental in terms of moving forward I would say equitable, inclusive, and just approach to conservation in Canada. Furthermore, I think some of these core principles of protected areas design around representation and connectivity, and we know there's a lot of work being done there on connectivity. These are important aspects for us to be considering alongside the habitats for species including, endemic species. And I think that's such an important role, and it's very clear Canada has a responsibility for those species primarily to step forward and make sure that those habitats are protected. So there's a lot here to factor into these conversations. It's a complicated space, but certainly Key Biodiversity Areas, KBAs, have a crucial role in terms of moving forward here in Canada and the great ambition in the decades to come. I do, of course, want to reiterate the critical role of Indigenous leadership as part of that conversation, as a pathway to getting to our 30% goal by 2030. And just before I end here, the map on the right is essentially the existing protected areas in Canada, then both marine and terrestrial realms. And I think it's definitely worth celebrating some of the biggest successes. And I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but certainly Lancaster Sound, now known as Telerupte-Pamanga. We've seen at least the Thaida-Ninene, which actually was deserving of the Equator Prize and acknowledged of that last week. These are examples of Indigenous-led conservation of, in some cases, massive area. And so I think there's a lot here to be proud about in terms of how Canada is moving forward within our protected areas strategy, and to use that momentum and to be rolling in the KBA's approach increasingly such that we have the convergence. And Ciara, it was great, to hear of the biocultural aspect. I've really been delighted to hear about that work that's underway with the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. But that interface between Indigenous-led conservation and pieces of information like Key Biodiversity Areas define how we can maximize the value for biodiversity by doing so in a just and inclusive way. For me, that's a really clear pathway in terms of how we can be moving forward for conservation, especially to protected areas in Canada. And I see some great momentum there. And so I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity to speak to that and how these elements are converging, and I think in a very timely way here in Canada. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, James. So as we move into the discussion portion of our webinar today, we have about 15 minutes left for questions. Please do go ahead and put your questions in that chat box, but it's also been brought to my attention that some people, particularly using the Microsoft Teams app, do not have access to a chat box. So I am going to change the settings so that all of the attendees will have the opportunity to unmute themselves and ask a question. We would prefer if you put your question in the chat box, but if that's not possible for you, go ahead and unmute and take the opportunity to ask a question that way. Okay, so we do have a couple questions, so I will go to the chat box and ask those. So Cheryl notes that she loves that the attention that KBAs are bringing to endemics, invertebrates, and plants in particular, and asks Dan, how is NCC using this information from KBAs to hold governments accountable to their biodiversity commitments provincially, territorially, and nationally?
Okay, that's a good question. We did structure the report to have it very clear which species occur within each jurisdiction, within each province or territory, recognizing it ultimately is the provinces and territories that manage wildlife. And we also identified species that we call subnational endemics as well. So to make it clear to, for example, British Columbia, that about 70% of the nationally endemic species actually only occur within British Columbia. So not only is it a national responsibility, it really just is up to British Columbia to protect those. So our main goal was really just to shine a light on these species where our failure, or the consequences of our failure to protect them is extinction. And I hope that that will be a starting point for a conversation about trying to ensuring that we actually don't let these species go extinct. As I mentioned, 8 of them have gone extinct, and we'll kind of give past generations the benefit of the doubt that they didn't have the information that we have right now. They went extinct without sometimes knowing that they were the last occurrences. We have this amazing information now, and there's more we can do on our list, but a pretty good starting point of species where if we want to stop the global extinction crisis and we want to start here in Canada, these are species that we can actually work on as Canadians. So I hope that will be enough. I think maybe in the future, having them as an indicator of conservation success might be a way to kind of measure our progress.
Okay. Ciara, in your presentation, there was a footnote to the pie charts that showed the national breakdown on the right, which said that certain groups like ground and tiger beetles were not included. Why is that?
So that's actually just because those groups were large enough to warrant their own slice of the pie. So it's not that they were not included entirely in the list of KBA trigger species. So we call trigger species or species that fit categories that could trigger a key biodiversity area if they meet certain thresholds within a site. So they are being included. In fact, we have already identified some sites for tiger beetles and some of those other categories as well.
Okay. I see that Erwin has raised their hand. Feel free to ask your question verbally if you'd like.
Sorry about that. The question, I just want to confirm that Canada was the only country to sign on to the commitment for land and marine at 30% by 2030. Is that true?
Not the only of the top 10 largest countries in the world. So there's a list of countries that have met the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and that goal specifically of protected areas. But of the largest countries in the world, the top 10, Canada is the only one.
Okay,
Wow,
thank you.
thank you very much. Get this huge lunch. Thank you so much.
Okay. So the next question that any of you can address, or is probably best suited for Ciara, is how is KBA information different from species distribution data?
That's a great question, and it would be good also to get the perspectives of Dan and James. So there are lots of different ways to figure out where you should be targeting, for example, land acquisitions, or where are the places that are most important for biodiversity. And one way to do that is to look at species richness, for example. So you might want to see where are all the species at risk in Canada. You can do that with species observations or with species range maps. So that's one way that people have done it in the past, sort of where are there overlaps in the ranges of many, many species at risk in Canada. And that might be an area that's important for biodiversity. But what key biodiversity areas bring to the table is this standardized quantitative approach. So if you're looking at species distributions and through range maps, for example, there's many parts of a species range where the species is not actually present. And a key biodiversity area goes that extra step and figures out, okay, well, which part of that range, which are the sites that actually hold a significant portion of a species population or an ecosystem extent, where you're capturing a remarkable amount or density of that species or ecosystem. So you know, for example, if it meets criterion 1, and it's a critically endangered species, you know that about 1% of the global population of that species is found in this site. That's remarkable, and that site therefore is particularly important to the persistence of that species. So it allows you to know that anything that's identified as a key biodiversity area, you really should be paying attention to that place. And there's not that many places that actually meet those thresholds. I mean, there are lots of places, but if you're looking at Canada-wide, we're talking hundreds of sites of a specific size. We're not talking, thousands and thousands of sites at all. So they're remarkable, and they're very valuable.
Okay, James Casey, you can ask your question verbally if you'd like.
Thank you so much. Very interesting discussion, folks. So thank you for the information. My question is around financial institutions. Internationally, there are financial institutions utilizing the concept of KBAs as one of their screens to inform investments. Does anybody on the panel or on the call know whether any Canadian financial institutions have expressed interest in using KBAs as a layer to screen for their Canadian-focused investments?
That's a great question, and if anyone wants to join in from the audience, we'd be very happy to hear from you. All I can say is that there are no formal indications of that at the moment. There is a lot of interest in trying to figure out how to feed this information broadly into decision making, including into financial mechanisms. We are looking at what's being done at the global scale. There's a great report that was done at the global scale, which is an end user report. We would like to do something similar in Canada to figure out who are the end users of key biodiversity area information and other ancillary products that we're developing as well, and how might they make use of them, so that if we have those discussions early on, it'll be more likely that they will be used in that way. So stay tuned. We'd love to have some stories about that for you in the future. We don't at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Ciara, I'll just add to that. I think that's the other important side of KBAs. I mean, as conservation planners, we kind of see it as a way to design where there should be parks or Indigenous protected and conserved areas. But the other side is from an industry perspective, it helps give them a bit of a roadmap about areas to avoid, to look at future sustainable resource use. And I think that, that's really something we can come together, because they'd like to know where those places are, well ahead of kind of the planning and application process. And so I think it is a really important tool that KBAs can provide, not just to the conservation community, but to the resource sector, and then ultimately the financial sector that helps to finance them.
Yeah, just to build on this, I think absolutely this is a really important factor for sustainability, governance-related issues, ESGs, is not only strict areas that are under current regulated protection, but of course those areas that have been designated with some important ecological value. And certainly I think leading companies globally, and if not here in Canada as well, ought to be looking at those kind of factors in terms of their own sourcing, supply chains, or their direct operations. And I think that's likely something where we have growing interest in as well for application here in Canada.
James, did you have a follow-up question to that?
All right, no, bad etiquette. I gotta lower my hand.
No problem. Okay, for all the panelists, how do you see the role of Indigenous knowledge in identifying and establishing KBAs? Given Canada's focus on reconciliation, what are some ways your organizations are having this conversation?
Well, I can answer in particular to KBAs just very briefly that so all forms of knowledge are appropriate in the work of identifying key biodiversity areas, and that's something that we are committed to. It's not really in the guidelines, although I think there is space for that at the global scale. We hope to, because this is such an emphasis of the Canada to Pathway to Canada Target 1 process more generally, we're learning from all the different working groups that are part of that pathway and trying to share resources in how do you actually then go about doing this work, conservation work, which has a history in Canada and globally, in a way that is more inclusive, and that's in a way that will lead to more relevant outputs for all Canadians. So a lot of that is also just making sure that people participate in the process. So reaching out to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit groups way in advance of doing the actual work, seeing if there's interest, seeing if there's a lot of questions, having a discussion beforehand, making sure that participation is happening at workshops and meetings, so that where there is information that should be shared or people want to share it, they can. And then we're also saying broadly we're available to provide information inputs into existing processes too. So for example, we're feeding into a couple of processes right now that are geared towards identifying or establishing new Indigenous protected and conserved areas. I'll leave it at that for now. So just James and Dan might have something to add.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think it can be a tool that lines up very well with Indigenous communities that are doing their own planning in their own territories. It's something that can line up with the work that they're doing to identify priority areas. I'll just add like in addition to identifying and establishing them, the other important thing is around their management. There are so many ecological systems in Canada that in the past benefited from Indigenous stewardship, and we haven't done a good job listening and incorporating those practices. So I think that that's the other really, really important role. It's not just figuring out where these things are, but it's how do we maintain the biodiversity values that they have, and often that relies on Indigenous knowledge and practices.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Ciara, for that question. I think it's very, it's a key question, and one that we're certainly trying to think through as much as possible right now in the kind of broader conservation space, and one that and I think many of those on the line here today, in terms of recognizing, how do we adopt this kind of two-eyed seeing approach increasingly in our work, and how do questions of traditional or local ecological knowledge come alongside this so-called, Western or Eurocentric approach to knowledge generation. And I think that's kind of a broader transformative approach, and one for me that I think has a lot of real kind of optimism and hope in terms of how we can be transforming our relationship with nature, and certainly something that I'd love to see here being brought into the core practice of KBA designation. And as Dan said, on the management side, in terms of equitable management, it's so critical as well.
Okay, we're just about out of time here. I realize there is a couple of questions that we haven't gotten to. So I'm going to again put my email address in the chat box. You can direct any follow-up questions there. Or if there are any very, very quick questions, we can probably take one more. Branimir, you have your hand raised if you'd like to ask a quick question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, my question is in terms of distribution of tasks among the conservation organizations, especially in terms of management. I'm thinking about Saskatchewan. In northern Saskatchewan, one KBA is in Lake Athabasca area. There's a lot of crown land, and a lot of management could be done by the third Indigenous conservation conservation areas. However, in the Cypress Hills, a lot of high-risk biodiversity areas is on private land, and especially on the agricultural land that has a very high potential of conversion, which may be Nature Conservancy, and their priority could be organization that maybe should have priority working on. So just my question for the NCC World Wildlife Fund, is the land management and land ownership being considered in planning of new protected areas?
I can start off. I think not initially in identifying where these important areas are. I think the first step in identifying KBAs are where are the values. But certainly in terms of management of those values, land ownership is critical. I think the model will be different, and the model needs to be different across the country and in different locations. Certainly important bird areas provided a little bit of a model about how we can bring people together to talk about the management. Nature Conservancy of Canada, we have our natural area conservation plans where we bring partners together. I think that the two key things are to manage the areas is to make sure everyone's at the table that needs to be there. But the other one is longevity. I think in some of the past IBA plans, part of the problem has been there's been a planning process, but not a lot of follow-up and not resources to implement the planning. So I think that will be key for these KBAs. It's the identification and mapping is a really important first step, but the actual community participation and conservation is that will be what decides if they're protected or not.
Thanks so much, Dan. I don't have anything to add. That's a great description, and I fully agree with you there.
Okay, thank you again, everybody, so much for joining us. Again, this is just the first of our webinars, so I've put my contact information, our website, and our Twitter account in the chat where you can find more information about upcoming webinars. Thank you especially to Dan and James for joining us today. We really appreciate your input. Thank you.